Greetings from Austin, Texas. I'm Jonathan Heaps, and I've been asked to speak to you a little bit about Frederick Crowe's Père Marquette lecture, Method in Theology, a New Organon for Our Time. And so my paper is titled The Springboard to the Future, How to Create a Modern Culture of Credibility and Cooperation. Bernard Lonergan argued that the transition to an empirical view of culture transformed the modern person's relationship to the past. Having recognized that collectively we are responsible for the worlds in which we live, the modern person, he or she, is no longer dedicated to perpetuating the wisdom of ancestors, but has come to view the past as, in Lonergan's words, the springboard to the future. Unlike many of modernity's detractors, Father Lonergan reported this development without sneering or intoning nostalgic lament. Instead, he surmised that this situation calls Christians to an age-old ecclesial task. Quote, disengagement from a culture that no longer exists, and involvement in a distinct culture that has replaced it. Fred Crowe, in his 1980 Père Marquette lecture, characterized Lonergan's method in theology as, quote, a new organon for effecting this engagement, this involvement in modern culture. He proposed the term organon in place of method, both because it suggested a whole mentality by which to pursue the needed knowledge for realizing our collective future, but also because it indicated, according to its biological connotation, that this mentality has, quote, a differentiated structure and specific function, serving the life of the body as a whole, close quote. Method in Theology, the book, spells out the differentiation of its internal structure, that is, the structure of functional specialization. But what of its place within the wider social and cultural structure? What of its specific function for and service to the life of the body of all of humanity? Now, in a number of essays prior to the publication of Method, Lonergan hinted that theological method, and indeed methodical control in all of our scientific and scholarly enterprises, was a matter of boosting and bolstering the credibility necessary for effective cooperation. For Christian engagement with and involvement in modern culture cannot be a one-sided endeavor. For the springboard of the past to be adequately compressed, the full measure of its potential energy unleashed, the collective weight of the whole human community will be required. Christians will not be able to join our modern fellows at its far end, however, unless we show ourselves reliable, quote, in the task of discerning humanity's true good in this life or in the task of bringing it about. Method in Theology, then, can be understood as an organon in the hunt for a modern culture of mutual credibility and cooperation. One concerned with realizing the common good for which we are, God help us, responsible. What follows, then, will consider the integral relation of cooperation and credibility, especially as they are considered in Lonergan's occasional essays from the 1960s. Along the way, I will trace the advent of certain cultural technologies for boosting credibility and their significant modern revision. In the home stretch, I will turn to consider the case of modern philosophy and theology among these. So first, Lonergan's theory of culture. On Lonergan's view, quote, the source of power in a community is cooperation, close quote. Cooperation can simply mean many hands applied to a common task. But the real power is unleashed with the division of labor and a coordinated but differentiated cooperative order. The prior condition, Lonergan thought, of such cooperation is precisely being a community, which for Lonergan means, quote, being people with a common field of experience, with a common or at least complementary way of understanding people and things, with common judgments and aims. Lonergan would abbreviate this litany to, quote, shared meanings and values, close quote. And these he gave the appellation culture. Simple cooperation requires we share an understanding of a common task and a sense it is worth doing. But a differentiated cooperative order makes mutual credibility essential. I have to trust you understand what you are doing and that it is worth setting you off to go do it, all without myself necessarily understanding the nuts and bolts of your task, except perhaps approximately where it fits in the order. Breakdowns in credibility, in turn, threaten the entire order. If I do not trust my fellows, I may withdraw from cooperation, sapping the community's power. Alternatively, I may feel the need to resort to force to impose my idiosyncratic vision of the order, preserving it for a time, but poisoning the roots of community via resentment or fear, whatever. The communities can err by excess in credibility as well. Misplaced trust or simple naivete invites catastrophes of mismanagement, negligence, corruption, and so on. Such culture as animates a community's cooperation may remain immediate in their way of life. It will be the common sense by which courses of action are judged prudent or foolish. But communities may, and often do, objectify the meaning and value of different cooperative departments and their products. So there are crafted the sigils, costumes, decorations, stylizations, entertainments, and so on, in and by which a culture expresses itself, as well as to its others. Such objectifications communicate across a cooperative order the meaning and value of the disparate departments, inviting credence among them. The quote-unquote excess or surplus labor devoted to such expressiveness symbolizes the commitment, the investment of those involved in an enterprise to one another. The expressive objectifications a culture produces for itself provide material occasion to reflect on the meaning and value not only of the community's products, but also on the departments that produced them, and most importantly, on the cooperative order that empowers the whole enterprise. Often, this reflection will spontaneously produce intra-community conflict. Differentiated cooperation empowers a community through the same surplus that underwrites cultural objectification to grow large enough that there will exist both departmental subcommunities, but also other kinds of affiliations and associations of fellow feeling. These subcommunities will, insofar as their community, also have a subculture, which will be partially the common meanings and values of the whole, but also partially a distinctive set marking them out within it. What seems meaningful and worthwhile to the larger community will seem, in the limit, stupid and pointless to this subcommunity. Conversely, the larger community will view the eccentricities of such subcommunities as inexplicable, and again, in the limit, deplorable. Of course, each group will appeal to their own common fund of meanings and values to justify their judgments, but because these are precisely what is not shared, inevitably a struggle for bare power will ensue over the direction of the community going forward. So, science as cultural superstructure. Lonergan thinks that science, and here think of the medieval scientia rather than modern lab coats and beakers. He thinks that science appears as a technique for establishing the credibility of meanings and values without appealing to brute power, without appealing to Thrasymachus's advantage of the stronger. But all along the way, from Socrates' insistence on universal definition to the high medieval Sume, and especially the early modern treatises, this classical form of science relied primarily on a logical ideal of knowledge, consisting in 5 elements: truth, certainty, knowledge, necessity, and causality. This has significant advantages over the slippery equivocations of common sense. Methodologically, it meant one could, quote, ascend from the earth to the heavens and beyond the heavens to the first mover, with no logical break between the knowledge of this world and knowledge of ultimate causes, close quote. It meant, in other words, that a science of God could be unproblematically integrated with the rest of what Lonergan called the cultural superstructure. And insofar as classical science sought to give an account of the human, the procedure was similarly logico-metaphysical. Quote, one was to know acts by their objects, habits by their acts, potencies by habits, and the essences of souls by their potencies. And so, quote, in his De Anima, Aristotle employed one and the same method for the study of plants, animals, and humans, close quote. But to sustain this methodological uniformity, classical science had also to maintain what now we consider a naive view about human cultures, namely, that there is only one, with a capital C, and to the extent one fails to participate in it, one is a barbarian. And so in this way, the intra- and intercommunitarian agon struggle had not been adequately expunged by a classical science of the human. The dominance of a logical ideal of knowledge in classical science made verification primarily a matter of valid inference and sound argument. The Cartesian complaint that such procedures produced not truth, certitude, knowledge, or necessity, but only plausibility, to say nothing of Hume's skepticism about causality, signaled a new problem for scientific knowledge. It sent Descartes and other rationalists searching for new foundations on which to rebuild its credibility. In theology, medieval doctrines, produced at the nexus of Lectio Divina and quadlibal disputation, had become conclusions to be deduced, with scripture and tradition rendered corresponding premises. What was gained here in logical clarity, coherence, and rigor was matched, unfortunately, by a significant loss in the operability of classical science as a credibility-boosting enterprise in the cultures of Europe. On the wider scene, Lonergan notes how the logical ideal of science did not just withdraw, but was also displaced. In order to place some constraint on rationalistic speculation, Lonergan reminds, the Royal Society in England had a rule, quote, questions were not considered unless they could be settled by an appeal to observation or experiment. Science was to be not just science, but empirical science, close quote. And so putatively unified natural philosophy would then transform into a cadre of increasingly autonomous, specialized, empirical sciences. Science, in other words, became itself a highly differentiated cooperative order, and its empirical method the criterion of credence within it. It was inevitable, Lonergan asserts, that the success of the new idea of science should profoundly affect the rest of the cultural superstructure, close quote. Creating the impression that human sciences to be credible must be, quote, conducted on the same lines as the natural sciences, close quote. And this is laudable to the extent that, quote, one observes performance, proposes hypothetical correlations, and endeavors to verify one's hypotheses as probably true, close quote. However, if this point of analogy between the natural and the human sciences is overemphasized, quote, distortion occurs in man's apprehension of man, close quote, producing a human self-understanding that is, if not mechanistic, then, in Lonergan's terms, theoryomorphic or animal-shaped. We might take excesses in evolutionary psychology as an example of the tendency to treat the rational animal foremost as animal and only superficially as rational. Lonergan pointed out some problems with such modern methodological uniformity. For one, it demands naivete about what the humanities investigate. Lonergan imagines sending investigators into a court of law. Long block quote here. They could count, measure, weigh, describe, record, analyze, dissect to their heart's content. But it would only be by going beyond what is just given and by attending to the meaning of the proceedings that they could discover they were dealing with a court of law. And it is only insofar as the court of law is recognized as such and the appropriate meanings are attached to the sounds and actions that the data for human science emerge at all. In other words, quantifying via measurement the sensible elements of a court, qua sensible, would fail to investigate that institution at all. The constitutive factor of human institutions can only be found in the meaning and value it holds for the people who enact them. And such procedures have an even more fundamental epistemological problem. Lonergan again. Another long quote, this time from Insight. If the sciences of nature can be led astray by the blunder that the objective is not the verified, but the quote-unquote out there, so also can the human sciences. But while this blunder in physics yields no more than the ineptitude of Galileo's primary qualities and Newton's true motion, it leads zealous practitioners of scientific method in the human field to rule out of court a major portion of the data and so deny the empirical principle behind the modern ideal of science. Still Lonergan, Durkheimian sociology and behaviorist psychology may have excuses for barring the data of consciousness, for there exist notable difficulties in determining such data. But the business of the scientist is not to allege difficulties as excuses, but to overcome them. And neither objectivity in the sense of verification, nor the principle of empiricism can be advanced as reasons for ignoring the data of consciousness, close quote. In other words, human sciences that pretend to an epistemologically stoic or Spartan or otherwise hard-nosed imitation of the natural sciences produce an intellectually tragic outcome. They aspire to scientific objectivity by a priori excluding data, which is an a priori unscientific commitment. Lonergan also considers what, until then anyway, had been a predominantly German approach to the sciences of the human, what Dilthey named the Geisteswissenschaften. Where the above approach had overextended the analogy with the natural sciences, this one, quote, stresses the basic difference between natural and human science, which lies in the very data of the two types, close quote. On this model, the humanities invite culture to appropriate itself precisely as, quote, the set of meanings and values that informs a way of life. Moreover, insofar as the Geisteswissenschaften accept that meaning is integral to and constitutive of their objects, They set out not to establish what human persons and communities are universally and necessarily, but to give progressive and cumulative account for, quote, all the people of every time and place, all their thoughts and words and deeds, the accidental as well as the essential, the contingent as well as the necessary, the particular as well as the universal, close quote. They aspire, in other words, to the modern scientific ideal, but without repeating the problematic methodological uniformity. All right, modern philosophy and theology. For Lonergan, the human sciences, qua Geisteswissenschaft, while certainly more adequate than their quantitative cousins, nevertheless face a persistent challenge. Quote, phenomenology and hermeneutics and history assume basic importance, close quote, for such studies, and so there develops an unavoidably close connection with or strong reaction against, quote, idealist, historicist, phenomenological, personalist, or existentialist thought, close quote. The underlying problem here is that philosophies are also cultural objects, constituted by meanings and values, albeit in this case about the nature of meaning and valuing. Resting the Geisteswissenschaften on philosophical foundations only moves the problem of their credibility back a level. If there are no credible means of settling philosophical disagreement, of verifying or falsifying philosophical meanings and values, then the credibility problem remains unresolved and the communitarian agon persists, albeit now in the thin air occupied by philosophical cultures. One might expect modern philosophical science should aspire to empirical verification, but mostly philosophers continue to rely on the logical ideal and its techniques. Some try to give philosophy a veneer of natural scientific procedure by engaging in quote-unquote thought experiments. But of course, from the perspective of the natural sciences, this is literally, explicitly inventing the data under investigation and would putatively serve as evidence. Now, phenomenological approaches fare much better at attending to the data as given, and philosophical hermeneutics has extended this enterprise into the conditions and dynamics of interpretation, while philosophies of historical mindedness raise the problem posed by the horizontal bounds of interpretive sense, a problem that remains, I think, the stickiest wicket. In Insight, Lonergan proposed a, quote, generalized empirical method in philosophy. Later, he would reframe this as intentionality analysis. Under either appellation, the intent is the same: to derive an integral heuristic structure, a transcendental method for all human inquiry, phenomenology, hermeneutics, and the philosophy of history included. He sought, to put it another way, to theorize the normative variable that gives rise to all cultural variation, including philosophical differences. A modern philosophy, if it would serve the credibility of the modern Geisteswissenschaften, cannot simply posit definitions of knowledge and decision and then dialectically hash out which meet the logical demands of clarity, coherence, and rigor. No, it must begin with and from such data as may pertain to knowledge and decision and be measured against the evidentiary data on the same. So Lonergan insists that philosophy needs, quote, full and precise answers to three basic questions. What is one doing when one is knowing? Why is doing that knowing? And what does one know when one does that? So much for knowledge, but for decision, we might add Patrick Byrne's three further questions. What is one doing when one is being ethical? Why is doing that ethical? What does one bring about by doing that? These are, in Lonergan's view, quote, the core contribution a philosophy can make to the humanities, to theology, and through all of these, to the human community. Above, I noted how the classical ideal of science made the integration of theology with the other sciences largely unproblematic, even if thinkers realized how revelation and faith made it something of a special case. But the modern ideal calls that integration into question. On the very first page of Method in Theology, Lonergan claims that modern theology, quote, mediates between a cultural matrix of meanings and values and the significance and role of religion in that matrix, close quote. A number of Lonergan's occasional essays from the 60s, upon which I have been extensively relying, reveal that he conceived of that mediation as, at least in part, serving the credibility-boosting function with which I am here concerned. Can modern theology's mediation be scientific, though? Again, modern science is empirical. Consequently, quote, it is methodologically geared to knowledge of this world. That, in Lonergan's terms, is its specialization. In the differentiated cooperative order of modern culture. The crux of the problem is that there are no data on God. An empirical science must begin from and find sufficient evidence among the data, and find sufficient evidence among the data. But the infinite and eternal, absolute and unconditioned God cannot be an object of experience. Consequently, modern science, quote, tends to replace theology with religious studies, which treat of humans and their supposed dealings with God or gods or goddesses, close quote. Still, Lonergan thought that even if, quote, increasing specialization prevents modern science from speaking of God, one would expect it to enable modern theology to speak of God all the more fully and effectively, close quote. But when Lonergan was putting the question to audiences in the 1960s, he thought the promise of theology as a modern science, in whatever analogous or even singular sense, remained unfulfilled. Method in theology and its model of functional specialization appeared in the subsequent decade as his framework for an answer. All right, final couple thoughts. Fred Crowe's point in An Organon for Our Time, however, was that Lonergan was not solving for a boutique methodological problem suffered in isolation by a confessional corner of academia. Rather, if I may put it in my own words, Lonergan saw the theological case as a particularly neuralgic version of the credibility crisis faced by every department in the School of Humanities. But even this is too narrow an aperture to take in the light of Father Lonergan's work. Crowe reminds us that, in Lonergan's view, logic, and with it presumably mathematics, quote, is derived from the dynamism of incarnate spirit, close quote. And, quote, the same remark can be made about the procedures of empirical method in the sciences, close quote. The crisis, as Husserl went to such great lengths to show, concerns the whole of the university. But even when we follow Lonergan in noting that the primary contribution philosophy can make not only to theology, but to every single scientific and scholarly department, consists in its answers to his three central questions and Burns' ethical addenda, I hope the foregoing has indicated how even this charts only the microcosm. The wider field of concern is the whole of the human future and our collective cooperation in guiding it. For even if the bright minds can raise the relevant questions, let alone settle the needed answers, still, it will remain to propose them to such communities as possess the corporate power and potency to act in light of them. It matters very much then on what basis the creative minority will be received, if they are received at all. Will only the promise of wealth move us to act together? Now, perhaps the 20th century taught us the allure of commerce is to be preferred to the threat of force, but still, that which is preferable is not always adequate. Father Lonergan, to conclude, put it this way: to know what is truly good and to effect it calls for a self-transcendence that seeks to benefit not self at the cost of the group, not the group at the cost of mankind, not present mankind at the cost of mankind's future. Concern for the future, if it is not just high-sounding hypocrisy, supposes rare moral attainment. It calls for what Christians name heroic charity. In the measure that Christians practice and radiate heroic charity, they need not fear they will be superfluous either in the task of discerning man's true good in this life or in the task of bringing it about. Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking with you in a couple of weeks. And until then, I hope that this has proved food for thought. Talk to you then.